With just a few mods, I turned Minecraft into a very difficult and occasionally realistic experience set sometime around the late 19th or early 20th century, during an event sometimes known as the Second Industrial Revolution. In this mod pack, as in real life, if you try to live unaided in a desert during the summer with no water, you will quickly die of either hyperthermia or dehydration, or possibly both. Oh, what's that? You wanted to eat nothing but golden carrots for years on end? Well, too bad, because if you don't eat a nutritious diet, bad things will happen. Feeling a sudden, irresistible urge to burn massive amounts of coal? Good luck with that, bro. And last but not least, tornadoes! During this 100 days video, I'll be doing everything I can to avoid falling prey to the dangers previously mentioned, while also constructing a large player-scale locomotive from Immersive Railroading. I designed this mod pack myself, and you can find it linked in the description if you want to check it out. In addition, I'm beginning a new season of my Patreon server the day this video is uploaded, using this mod pack. So if you want to follow along in the series with other players on an SMP server, for $5 you can become a patron by following the link down below. Big shout out to all my patrons, I really appreciate your support. If you enjoyed the video and want me to make a sequel, be sure to drop a like and hit that subscribe button. I'm trying to get to 250,000 subscribers and I need your help. Thanks! I must admit, the spawn could have been significantly worse than it was. At least there were no machine gun wielding skeletons or volcanoes in the vicinity. Just a couple of creepy looking abandoned structures. And of course, plenty of gravel that I could use to get flint to make flint tools. But before I could do that, I had to go explore the little creepy structure, because of course, that's what you would do. It had a little easy to disable arrow trap and some utterly useless loot. Some random soggy gardens that I found in the wild, yes, they're called that, it's kind of funny, ended up being much more useful than any loot that I got from the first structure. But the second structure that I encountered ended up being a little villager outpost with a nice wall and some animals and a bit of loot on the inside, including some ore and some food, which was super helpful given that I have 3 berries and 2 apples at the time. I even set off a nice fireworks display upon collecting iron. Here's me going through the basic quests in the quest book so that I could unlock all the other chapters. If you want to read what I wrote there, you can pause the video as I scroll through it. But essentially, what I needed to do after completing all that basic stuff was make a set of flint tools, which first involved making the flint knife, which I crafted just in time to fend off a random baby zombie villager that appeared out of nowhere. I still have no idea where this dude came from, but he got wrecked anyways. I used that flint knife to break some grass to get some plant fibers and make some plant string, which I then used to make a flint hatchet, allowing me to get wood. But by that point, it was nighttime, and I decided to sleep because I did not want to get stuck outside with only a flint hatchet and knife with about 10 durability each. And just as I completed my set of flint tools, a tornado developed off in the distance and began rushing toward me. So I just sat there on top of the wall looking at the map that I got from the quest book. I decided to save the villager, and the pig just went flying right in front of me, but I was able to get inside the house in time before the tornado became directly over the outpost. It did do some damage, but I ended up being okay, and it passed over me after about a minute. I set off on a journey through the forest to gather more food and look for a cool spot to live, and eventually found one of those volcanoes I was talking about, and also happened to be right next to a nice flowing river, which is exactly the kind of place I was looking for. I spent the rest of day 1 just preventing the forest from burning down from all the lava everywhere, and I got to see this really nice view of the moon rising above the river off in the distance. All I really did the next day was just enlarge the bank of the river and turn it into a nice cave that I could make my home for a time. Helped along greatly by Vein Miner, I must add. On day 3, I started making some basic tools to make my life easier, using the ore that I'd gathered while mining out the little cave to turn into my base. And I set myself up with enough stuff to go do a bit of exploring to see what kind of cool stuff I could find nearby. Mainly, I found a bunch of food, which is good, because it's always something that you need in this mod pack, and I found a couple other structures. But when I got back, I took some time to complete a bunch of the main Industrial Revolution quests, which will unlock a bunch of the other quest book pages that I can start going through. You can see I'm claiming them all here. And I got a bunch of loot chests from that. They give me random items, which can often include food. I didn't even stop exploring once it became nighttime and the zombies started showing up to steal my food. I journeyed downriver and found this really cool big tree biome. I don't remember what it's called, but it just has really tall trees. I ended up spending the night out in the wild with my sleeping bag, and while most people might take an early morning jog, I took an early morning zombie horde killing session, which was very relaxing, and also provided a lot of exercise. It didn't take very long for me to locate a village pretty close to my house, and it took even less time to completely fill my inventory with loot from the village, mostly food and wood, but it forced me to go back to my base to dump stuff in chests, including the holy grail of storage, the dirt chest 9000. With a whole inventory slot of space, you can store all of your dirt in this. You can store so much, a stack of dirt. Oh my gosh, it's just amazing. If you want to read that, you can. Sorry about that. I got a little bit distracted by the dirt chest 9000. For some reason, I found a candy cane crowbar and a ton of loot that I couldn't use, as most of it's locked behind the interstellar age of all things. The next morning, I got a message telling me that there would be an invasion tonight. Apparently, it's very spooky, according to what the game says. But it didn't stop me from decorating my base a little bit more, slicing up some leather pants with a knife to get leather, and returning to the village to get yet more loot, which included a ton of arrows and enough leather for me to make a backpack, so that I can get even more loot without having to return. The invasion started while I was at the village, and it consisted mostly of just a bunch of zombies. But there was a compressed zombie, and when I killed it, 9 more zombies came out of it. In fact, I killed so many zombies in one house that the house blew up. Seem counterintuitive to you? Well, I mean, a little bit. The explosion was created by too much pollution in one spot from all of the mobs dying. The last couple days had been spent gathering plenty of food and resources from the village, but what I really needed now was different ores from the cave. So I was able to locate a ravine after a little bit of searching, relatively close to my base, and I set about gathering every single ore that I could possibly find. The main limiting factor being my pickaxe durability, because in this version of the mod pack, iron ore veins can generate much larger than normal. I'm not quite sure which mod does this, but it means that it's possible to find a lot of ore relatively quickly. And once I ran out of stuff to get at the ravine, I just dug a staircase down all the way to bedrock from my base, where I found yet more ore, including tons of coal, which made a bunch of pollution which slowly drifted up my staircase, poisoning me. With my newly found resources, I made a weather deflector and a weather radar to be able to keep track of all those pesky tornadoes coming off of the ocean, because that's how it works in this mod. On day 10, I tamed my first horse to make exploring even easier, and that day's travels took me to a variety of places and events, including getting my first diamond from this big pillar of stone that generated in the middle of the open. I found a hamster in the middle of the mesa for some reason, and a desert village really close to a nuclear wasteland biome, which is something I don't want to be really close to. I even found a desert temple far away in the desert, which contained a ton of crazy loot. I mined a bunch of sandstone and went to sleep in the desert temple, and the next day I returned back to my base, where my horse promptly disappeared upon dismounting. Anyone remember that fun glitch that used to be in the game? Well, luckily for me, it's in this version. Let's go! I made a quick pen for my horse to keep it safe, and went swimming in my local lake to get a bunch of clay to use to turn into coke bricks to make 2 coke ovens so that I can begin turning coal into coal coke. I made a few extra tools, including a preemptive jerry can, knowing I'd have to deal with a bunch of creosote oil soon. It also seemed a good time just to throw down the little alloy kiln, as the materials for it are almost the exact same as the coke oven, and I already had all of that put together. On day 13, it was time to start playing Farming Simulator before the winter comes. But I'm gonna take a guess that there's probably not random black holes in Farming Simulator. If I'm wrong, I'm sure some people who've played it will correct me down in the comments. Unfortunately, however, my farming endeavors were a little bit interrupted by an ill-timed tornado and invasion. On day 14, I continued decorating and expanding my base. I made some cool bricks to turn into arches that lead into what will one day become a train station. But for now, it just goes to a stone wall. I even had to upgrade some of my chests to iron chests, as they were all running out of storage room, in addition to my coke ovens, which were all filled up with creosote oil, as I knew would happen all too quickly. The next day, I made my first diamond pickaxe and descended back into the mines, into a ravine I'd found nearby my base, full of tons of ore that I needed lots of. It was overall a very productive day, and when I got back, I threw stacks and stacks of ore into my chest. Mind you, I threw almost everything I'd collected into my chest. Why is that important? Well, yeah. It's important because I lost almost all of it to a pollution explosion that incinerated my chest and dumped the items into fire, meaning that I had to spend the next couple days recovering from what I'd lost. I started by destroying the volcano that was out in my front yard because it was inconvenient, and I'd get some blocks and obsidian from it anyways. Day 17 and 18 were spent setting up vents in my base to prevent more pollution explosions and gathering additional resources both underground and above ground. I also got extremely lucky with a loot chest when I got a legendary reward. It's not something I can use quite yet, but spoiler alert, it's an awakened draconium core or something like that. On day 19 I found uranium and diamonds underground, in addition to a lot of slightly less valuable but no less useful ores and gems. Eventually I came across a weird lava pool that had a bunch of leaves in it and some cool frozen caves. And this time all the resources I gathered from mining didn't get incinerated in a pollution explosion. I realized I hadn't fully set up my ventilation system, so I dug the proper vent shaft and got the pump all installed to get rid of that pollution. And afterward I went back to that cool big tree forest and found this neat looking circle of stones in the woods. But of course, all good things must be interrupted as an invasion decided to occur that night. It is technically on a schedule, but it always seems to happen at the worst times. I kind of just ignored the invasion when I got back and worked on crafting some stuff and messing around with my bees. I ended up not having too much trouble with it overall, except when a creeper almost blew up my farm right next to me. All that free food from the loot box rewards from my quest book would only last so long, and I knew that it was imperative that I had to keep growing as much food as I could in preparation for the winter, which was not very far away. It is very easy to forget the cold in the Nether, and also apparently the mad scientist junkies were having a bad time. Still don't know what that was about. But yes, it's that time again, time to explore the Nether. And unlike in vanilla, you can die of dehydration in the Nether, you can also die of overheating in the Nether, but at the very least, certain mobs that drop blaze rods or blaze powder spawn randomly throughout the Nether and not just in Nether fortresses. That's about all that makes the experience bearable. I was able to get away without having to make the fancy slime armor, because I realized that given how long I spent in the Nether at any one time, it meant that I wouldn't need to actually worry about overheating because I could just return to the overworld, and I found enough of the foxhounds to get 9 blaze powder, which, in case you're wondering, is used to make the blast furnace. Not the vanilla blast furnace, that thing is lame compared to this. No, we're making the big modded steel making blast furnace. So after only one day off and on in the Nether, I was able to get 9 blaze powder to make my blast furnace. A whole lot better than the multi-day ordeal that was the Nether in my first Industrial Revolution series. While waiting for stuff to smelt, I checked out a little graveyard across the lake from my base, and it had some surprisingly useful stuff in it. Those boots have an enchantment that will allow me to stay a little bit warmer during the winter, and that book is, well, I don't know how useful it is, but it's interesting. There, you can read it if you want. Significantly more useful though was the fossil that I found in the woods nearby. It had tons of bone blocks, and I shaved off a few layers of it and got a ton of bone meal. And when I got back, I was able to make all of the blast bricks that I needed to make one full blast furnace. It is only the crude blast furnace for the time being, but I need steel to make the better blast furnace, so all in good time. Got some steel from my blast furnace, and I opened a few loot boxes and got baritol, of all things, in the Industrial Revolution. Won't be needing the high explosive for a while yet, but eventually. I made a big hammer so that I can break a bunch of blocks at once in a much more precise manner than with vein mining, and I use this method to clear out a bunch of area behind my current base so that I could have a lot more room. I also found a very satisfying method of converting the floor directly into the type of chiseled stone that I wanted just by right-clicking it with my diamond chisel. I set up a little shelf area that I'd use for my storage a little bit farther away, hopefully from the pollution, so if any more explosions do occur, it won't take all of my items with it. On day 25, I made my first steel tool, specifically a steel sword. You could probably call it a weapon. And I also began looking into some of the power transfer quests. Fortunately, I don't have any terracotta, and you need terracotta to craft most of the power connectors, so I journeyed to the mesa, veined mine one time in some terracotta, and got plenty. But it still took forever to get back home because I got stuck in a really weak tornado that wasn't strong enough to pick me or my horse up, but it was strong enough to make it super annoying and almost impossible to get out of until it left. Back at my base, I made some wire connectors and relays and the actual wire coils. Now all I need is something to power it. The next day I worked on making the advanced blast furnace from the steel that I already had, because it only takes 27 steel plates and I'd had more than enough by that point. Basically what the advanced blast furnace will do is it will allow me to attach preheaters to the blast furnace, thereby speeding it up with a little bit of power, which I don't have yet, but we're getting there. I made the power transformer, and I completed the power transfer quest, and the rest of the day I went out in search of coal, because at that point I'd pretty much either turned all of it into coal coke or used it all in smelting other ore, which is something I wouldn't have to do much longer. The next day it was time to start making power generation. I started off by making 2 windmills and gathering some of my industrial hemp to try to make some windmill sails. But as of course, as it often happens when I'm farming, an invasion decides to turn up and ruin my day with hordes of zombies trying to kill me. Makes it a little bit difficult to gather industrial hemp. A creeper snuck up right next to me and blew up right next to all my stuff, but for some reason it didn't barely break any blocks despite blowing up on wood, at least I think it did. I'm not going to complain though, I'm just happy it did less damage than it did. But of course, another creeper showed up right as I put down my clock and blew it right off the wall, which did a lot more damage than the first creeper. After a night of creeper explosions in my base, I was happy to set up my windmills the following morning. I needed them for something very specific right away, which will help me a lot produce more coal coke, just simply by using less coal to smelt stuff. So what I did was I made some external heaters and stuck them behind some furnaces and gave them power, and then what that will do is it'll just smelt items in the furnaces without any actual fuel as long as they have power. Unfortunately, 2 windmills with almost no windmill cells don't produce a lot of power though, so it was still pretty darn slow even though it was technically smelting without coal. I began looking into some better forms of armor because if creepers were going to be blowing up next to me on a regular basis, I figured I might need some better defenses. The light engineer armor seemed like a fairly good candidate, but it required me to make some blueprints and stuff that I didn't already have. The really good thing about this armor is that you can upgrade it with a bunch of different components to do different functions. Some of those components are actually just extra armor layers, which make it more tough than it already is, which is pretty cool. I started off by making the helmet and the chest plate for the armor because I was already wearing a little bit of armor that increased my speed slightly, which wasn't quite broken yet. I realized my lake was starting to freeze, and I immediately made use of the ice to set up a quick little thermoelectric generator to produce a little bit more power to supplement the windmills and hopefully speed up my furnaces. But when it comes to passive or kinetic power, nothing really beats the water wheels, especially since you can stack several of them on one kinetic dynamo. I started out by making 3 of them, which I think is the limit per kinetic dynamo. I could be wrong about that. And I set up a little area in the flowing river to stick them. One of the great things about these 2 mods, the Streams mod and Immersive Engineering, is that for whatever reason, the water wheels treat flowing water just like it would normal water, and it works just fine, so it looks super cool in the process of generating power. Once I connected the water wheels to my tiny power grid, the furnaces were doing just fine and had plenty of power. While on my way to gather resources the next morning, I found this buried marble structure that had this cool floating crystal in the middle of it and a little bit of interesting loot, including some aquamarines, or just 1 aquamarine. I made a pit stop at the desert village to grab some more arrows, and my final destination was the desert, where I was off to get a bunch of sand, sandstone, and jasper, and any ore that I might find along the way. The reason I needed all of these materials was so that I could begin working on my big factory building that will house all of my machinery. When I returned back late that evening on the second day of gathering resources, I grabbed the leaves from a dying tree and I deployed them the next morning in my first pollution filters on my coke ovens. Before I could really begin building any of my factory building though, I needed concrete. And the only way for me to make concrete in this mod pack is to make it in the Immersive Engineering Mixer multi-blocks. After a bunch of miscellaneous crafting, I eventually completed the quests I needed to and got to the Mixer quest, which I started working on building on day 34. But a few weird things happened that day before I was able to actually make my multi-block. For one thing, it was very dark outside in the early morning of the day for some reason, but it didn't concern me too much. I just carried on building my stuff until I got attacked by this weird android robot, which I was able to kill with a bow and arrow. That just kind of works despite it having a laser rifle. But that wasn't the only weird thing, because when I finally went outside, I realized that the reason it had been dark is that there was a at least partial lunar eclipse earlier that day, which was very spooky. And of course, to make matters worse, right as I formed the multi-block, a tornado was arriving on the horizon, and that night, an invasion was happening. But it wasn't just any old invasion, it was an invasion consisting of illagers, which apparently involved illusioners, or something that was making me blind, up above ground. And when I started to return underground, I got swarmed by a horde of Vexes. It didn't matter how many I killed, there were just more and more of them all the time. My shield was taking huge amounts of damage, my armor was taking damage, I was running out of food, and I essentially spent the entire night underground fighting stupid Vexes. There were several points where I did come close to dying, but somehow I managed to survive the entire night. And when I went above ground, I never saw any evokers or anything else. I saw a few illusioners in the distance, but that was really it. So I don't know if the Vexes spawned on their own or not, but boy, that was not fun. As you might expect, I started preparing for another invasion like that might happen in the future by making a heavy plated shield and upgrading it with these shock emitter things. So basically what those do is when you charge up the shield or wear a capacitor backpack, when something tries to attack you through the shield, they'll get knocked back and take a little bit of damage. I finally got my mixer all started up and producing the liquid concrete, not very quickly though, which was just as well because I had to spend some time making a heating coil and fighting off mobs, but at least I got to test out my shield, as you can see here with this zombie. Late that night I got 4 buckets of liquid concrete and used it to make a full stack of concrete blocks. Happily I randomly got a chem thrower from a loot chest the next morning, and I made myself a capacitor backpack because I realized charging the shield by itself was good for about 1 use. But at that point I really needed emeralds for something, and having none already, I set out in search of some in either a structure or maybe a random naturally generated terrain formation or something like that. My travels took me through many different structures, including villages where I gathered lots of different loot items, although most of it was food or treasure items that I had no use for, except for an enchantment table, which was very nice and I can definitely use any time. I found so much loot while exploring that I had to upgrade my storage capacity back at my base, although I somehow didn't manage to find a single emerald among all of that stuff. But before I could set back out again, I had to make a fluid tank to hold all of my creosote oil because I was getting so much of it. Armed with craftable steel horse armor, yes, you heard me right, I returned to one of the villages I'd found the previous day, and traded away some of my precious coal coke for 3 emeralds from a modded villager. And I realized that this villager and others like it could be extremely useful if only I could get them back to my base. But there might be a solution to that if I could get an ender pearl. As I was on my way home that night, I found a graveyard like what I'd already found before, and it had 4 emeralds in it. If I'd checked this graveyard sooner, I wouldn't have had to trade away my coal coke. But it is what it is now, and I just have more emeralds than I had before. And what do I need those emeralds for? Well, I need them for some building gadget related things so that I can make my factory more easily. But before I got too ahead of myself with that, I wanted to get those villagers from the village, which involved making something called a morb. Some sort of pokeball kind of thing for mobs, at least that's how I think it works. And yes, it does seem to work that way. You just throw the little capsule at the mobs and it sticks it inside, and then you can carry it around as an item. It's the ultimate form of villager napping. The following morning, the game announced there would be an invasion that night, so I figured that it'd be a good idea to go ahead and make a safe spot for the villagers to live in a little room with a steel door where no mobs should be able to get to them, because one, the mobs wouldn't really want to dig to them from the invasion, they theoretically would want to dig to me, and random mobs shouldn't be able to break down the steel door. At least that was my theory. I did some trading with the villagers and started leveling them up, and some of them were able to trade some pretty cool stuff, the most interesting being a mineral deposit map, which apparently leads me to a uranium vein, I'm assuming for an excavator. I've never used that before, but I'm going to assume that's how that works. Right before the invasion started, I made full light engineer armor and had to kill a ton of mobs that were trying to dig down through my ceiling. But the next morning, after the invasion ended, it had turned out that all my villagers were dead. For some reason, the invasion spawning mechanics spawned zombies inside the closed off lit up room, which I find extremely annoying and frustrating given that 1, it's closed off, 2, there is literally no dark spots in there. And to make matters worse, it just, like, the room started blowing up because of pollution, because of all the death. It even glitched out my nether portal. It was not a fun time these couple days. I had a lot of problems with pollution. There were multiple pollution explosions that happened at various points, and there was plenty of fixing my base on top of having my villagers dead before I could even trade very much with them. I slowly began recovering from all the emotional damage, in part by starting to work on my factory building, which involved creating a schematic. I'd already assembled the factory building completely in a different world, and all I needed to do was get a schematic of it in this world so that I could start attempting to build it block for block. Granted, the schematic didn't copy certain tile entities like framed blocks, so not all of it is in the schematic, but the vast majority of it is there. Once I got it anchored in the world where I wanted it relative to everything that was already there, I started working on the concrete floor. But I quickly ran into some problems with the copy-paste tool, because I accidentally right-clicked with it while trying to eat, and it just dumped all of the blocks into the world from my inventory. In other words, it just did it in one click, everything that it could. I did that again when I started to run out of blocks in my hand. Technically, this isn't a problem with the mod, that's how it's supposed to work, but I was trying to do it without just having it copy-paste the blocks in the world for me, but without very much luck. After looking at the actual material list of the schematic, I realized that the amount of stuff that I'd already gathered from the desert was nowhere near enough for what I needed, so I went back and found more jasper, grabbed a ton of that. I even grabbed a couple villagers from the desert village to try to replace the ones that had died, and I was about to go and try to get more sand and everything, but it turned out that there was a blood moon and an invasion happening on the same night. So basically all I could do was just dig underground and hope that I'd be safe. Which I wasn't, because I was too close to the nuclear fallout biome, the nuclear wasteland, so I literally started to get radiation poisoning just sitting underground, waiting for hordes of spiders to go away. Eventually daytime arrived and the spiders became peaceful, but there were still a ton of mobs above me, and somehow my horse didn't die from that explosion. Thankfully, that evening was much more peaceful in a nice forest biome. On day 50, I did make it back to my base where I dumped all my stuff into chests right away, and promptly forgot about getting any of the slow-acting rat away that I claimed from some of the early quest book quests. Instead, I started checking out my quest book and looking at the different quests related to trains and railways, because it was about time to start working on some of that stuff. I did eventually remember to get the rat away and was able to remove the bad effects of the radiation, and I mostly completed some high-speed tracks for the quest, but it turned out that I needed blaze powder because of course, so I had to go to the Nether and find some. After returning from the Nether, I made the Immersive Railroading Manual, which is basically this book that doesn't actually function as a book. It's more like a hologram projector, and it shows you how you make all the different machines and what parts you need. And once I did that, I just finished up a little bit of quest book stuff by making the high-speed tracks. I spent most of day 52 swimming around a freezing cold lake, gathering up tons of clay to make different building materials for my factory, including various bricks and shingles, which happen to also require bricks. I noticed that for some reason most of the trees in the vicinity of my base were starting to die, which was kind of strange. My current theory is that it has something to do with the sulfur pollution killing the trees, because there's barely any carbon, and otherwise I'm not really sure what would be causing that. Maybe someone down in the comments knows. Yesterday I had spent the whole day gathering clay from that lake, and today I needed to spend most of my time gathering sand and sandstone. Much of the sandstone ended up coming from this cool abandoned structure that was sunk into the ground. Didn't have very much loot, so I just decided to vein mine it for its sandstone. And then I did a big dumb while mining sand because I was too close to the nuclear wasteland biome and managed to irradiate myself yet again. No matter, in the end I got what I needed from the desert and survived to tell the tale and make tons and tons of bricks back at my base the next day. By the evening of the 54th day, I had pretty much all of the stone I would need, but I was still missing a bunch of different types of birch wood, so that's what I did the next morning is I just bone mealed a bunch of saplings and got tons of logs. A little bit of work with the chisel later, and I had basically everything that I needed, including another blast furnace for my factory. At last, evidence of spring appeared in the form of my lake starting to melt, which was a very welcome sign because I was getting really tired of just freezing 24/7 despite having the heating coils nearby. It would certainly make assembling my factory much nicer, but I still had to contend with the problems of the copy-paste gadget. I started out attempting to continue filling in the schematic block by block, but eventually after more misclicks I just gave up and filled it in with one click with everything I had in my inventory, which wasn't that much of the factory, but it certainly was pretty fast. One zombie randomly dropped an SMG from tech guns, and for whatever reason, the NBT tags on the SMG dropped by mobs means that it's not locked behind the nuclear age, so I was able to use it until I ran out of ammo, at which point it became locked. And it did allow me to take revenge on the mobs that unceremoniously killed my horse with their own SMGs. If only it did have more ammo though, because I had the worst time ever trying to get back to my base that night. I just continually got followed by mobs that were shooting me back into the river and off of cliffs. It was just horrible. All of the struggle prompted me to look into upgrading my armor yet further with some additional composite plates, or maybe it's just steel plates. The composite plates might be fancier. I also made internal springs for my boots, which basically completely negate fall damage, so I can jump off, as far as I know, as high of a place as I want, and I'll take no fall damage. It doesn't make me bounce in the air though, unfortunately, despite being called springs. And once I'd equipped the extra steel plates to my armor, I got even more armor. It's like an extra third of a row of armor bars. It's kind of crazy. And I rounded off this productive stretch of days by assembling some more of my factory with the blocks that I had on hand already. Although I'm sure you can tell that there is probably still a lot of work that needs to be done to it by hand, including adding some sort of basement foundation so half of it's not just floating in the air. But I have more pressing matters to attend to, such as making a crusher so that I can get more of certain resources for literally no extra effort. It's the best thing about this machine. For things like blaze rods, I get way more blaze powder. For things like coal ore, I can get 4 pieces of coal. And it's basically guaranteed fortune for everything else, including non-fortunable ores. Only problem is I don't have enough power to run the crusher constantly with the current kinetic setup that I have. However, there is another method of power generation that's a little bit better than kinetic, that it doesn't require me to make an entire diesel generator. It's a basic boiler setup that burns coal relatively quickly to make a little bit of steam, and then you can run that steam into small generators to make a few hundred RF per tick. If only I could somehow make power from tornadoes, because then I'd have all the power I would ever need. I'd be all set. The boiler tank requires brass, which is something I hadn't made before, but it finally gave me a use for all the zinc I'd been getting. Made some brass plates and turned those into the boiler blocks, and then I just went down the line of the little miscellaneous things that I needed for the multi-block. I want to say it was either a blood moon or an invasion night that night, so I couldn't sleep, so I just spent the whole night working on making a revolver of my own so that I can shoot back at all the mobs with their guns. And the next day I made the blueprint for making ammo cartridges, and I made about as much ammo as I could. It takes an entire thing of gunpowder per bullet, which is a little bit expensive. Of course, I can't ever seem to do anything without needing blaze powder, which is the case for this boiler multi-block. The controller needs blaze powder, so I had to go run around the Nether for a few days. Finally, a blaze actually dropped a blaze rod, and the great thing about that is that I can get 4 blaze powder from it in the crusher instead of just 2. Which is exactly what I did so that I could have myself a boiler controller and all of the rest of the components for my basic boiler setup. It took me a little while to get it fully running. I first had to build the thing, which is a little bit more difficult than you might think, because for some reason it doesn't like to auto output the fluid or the steam. You have to attach a pump to the boiler vent to actively pull out the steam instead of having the block just push it out on its own, which would have been much nicer. But eventually I did get it, so it was coming out, and I connected it up to the little generators. But I had to remember how you actually use the generators. I first tried attaching wire connectors to them, which didn't work. But once I just attached the wire by itself, it worked great, and I had plenty of power to run my crusher all the time. This left me free to start work on the first of the immersive railroading machines that I need, which happens to be the giant casting basin, where you get most of your parts for trains from by throwing in steel and then selecting whatever you want to cast. But of course, guess what it needs? It needs 86 blast bricks, which take blaze powder to make, so we have to go back to the Nether at some point. I couldn't be bothered to do that right away, so I started just working on the heavy engineering blocks instead. Not that that's necessarily much easier, but at least it doesn't involve running around literal heck. It was a pretty good time to get out my villagers that I'd captured as well, so that I could buy scaffolding off of them, and I could also buy the steel mechanical components instead of having to use as much as my own steel. But as often happens in modded Minecraft, I got distracted with some other stuff, namely working on making my kitchen better, although I'd say that it's a pretty decent distraction given that I was running out of all the food that I'd gotten from my loot chests. and I would really need to begin making more of my own soon. So I started setting up the multi-block kitchen, which for me is really fun. I really like using pans along with cooking for blockheads, and then just taking a look at all the different stuff I can make and then trying to figure out what I'm missing. It's a whole experience that I can't really describe unless you've played it yourself, but if you've played it, you'll know what I mean. It's super fun. About the best thing that I could make at the time was a few sandwiches, but it was enough to get me started in the Nether. By the way, 2 pro tips for exploring the Nether in this mod pack that I learned. 1, if you make the well block, literally just a block called a well, you can get water bottles out of it even in the Nether. And 2, if you bring the antique atlas to the Nether, it might show the location of another fortress if it's nearby, even if you haven't seen it or can't see it with your own eyes. So, I would highly recommend bringing both of those, and it will make your time much easier, much faster. As you can see, I located another fortress quite quickly and proceeded to loot it of all of its cool stuff. It was kind of destroyed at points in the middle by this weird like blood biome. And of course I had to become a vampire briefly by refilling my water bottles at the pool because that just works. I found a bunch of gunpowder and even a sniper rifle in one of the chests. And it wasn't long before I could find one of the blaze spawners either. I may be dying of heat stroke, but boy is it so much nicer getting blaze rods this way than racing around the Nether waste, finding like 1 blaze per 5 minutes. Ah, just look at all these sweet resources I have now. Oh, look at that. That's a full stack of blaze powder. I am just so rich and amazing at this game. Oh wait, that's a blood moon. Okay, well, I think you guys probably know what it's time for now. Time to go back into the mines. There was another lunar eclipse on day 70 that happened to coincide with the tornado, so it made it very spooky looking outside. Which is just fine by me. I like it when it looks cool outside, both in real life and in video games. But I couldn't stand around admiring the view for all of the day. I had a casting basin to make, which only took 1 click because the manual, just once you have everything in your inventory, it'll just dump it all into the world for you. But then I spent an embarrassingly long time trying to figure out how to form the multi-block, only to realize that I needed a bigger hammer, bigger wrench thing. As you can see, I can do a whole lot with this multi-block. It makes not only the pieces for rails, but also pretty much the pieces for every single locomotive and train car that's in the mod. All you really have to do is give it some power and throw some steel on the top of it, and then it will just put the steel in an inventory. And you can select whatever you want to cast, and then I just cast it at one time. Like here, I made a rail segment, I believe it's what it's called. Yeah, it's a rail casting, and so this thing is just like the raw piece for rails. And I can't do anything with it quite yet. This right here is the train I'm going to be making, and you can see these are all the different parts that I'm going to have to cast for the train. There's some other parts that it's going to need as well that aren't made only in the casting basin, but pretty much the vast majority of it is made there. And all of it uses a lot of steel. You could see that the frame alone took almost 2 stacks of steel. So I decided I would just go ahead and cast the frame using almost all of the steel that I already have. But I definitely need to upgrade my steel production, which I did by making some external heaters for my blast furnaces. Late that night I got the frame for my train, but I can't really do anything with it because I don't have any rails to put it on yet. And that's where the rail machine comes in. I think that's what it's called. It's one of the other multi-blocks from Immersive Railroading. It's this really long and thin machine that you just stick the rails in, the rail castings, and then it hammers it or something and turns it into railway components that you can make track out of. I randomly got sidetracked, no pun intended, and ended up making a cow in a jar real fast because I was starting to run out of my dairy nutrition, so I figured I would just get my infinite dairy supply. It's definitely a very humane way of getting milk. There's nothing wrong at all with the way this mod works. Lots of dairy consumption and crafting later, I had everything I needed for my rail machine. And that night, I assembled it right next to the casting basin and ran my unfinished rail segment through it the next morning before I got picked up by a tornado and flung around in the air for a few minutes. Once it finally went away by that evening, I started looking around in the back of my factory so I could figure out where I might set up my railway. I had some cool ideas, but I needed more materials before I could begin executing them. Namely, I needed wood for treated wood, needed coal for a lot of different things, and I needed gravel for putting underneath my track. I gathered pretty good quantities of all of these on day 75, working throughout the whole day and into the night. This little structure right here with these emeralds, that's exactly what I was looking for all those days ago when I was trying to get emeralds to begin with, but I couldn't find until after I already had the emeralds I needed. I turned most of the wood that I gathered into treated wood because I was going to use it as the platform for my railway. I'm going to turn it into a kind of bridge eventually, but first I just really needed a place to start putting down rails so I can stick my train onto the ground. The rails themselves just take the rail segments and some treated wood, so they're not terribly expensive. I worked on the railway as long as I could until an invasion started and a ton of hostile bats started trying to kill me. But nevertheless, I got a fair amount of work done on it, and I think it's going to look really cool. Most importantly, it was big enough for me to put down the frame of my locomotive, but I had a few problems with that. When I tried to pick it up, it duplicated itself every single time. I have no idea why it's doing this when I'm trying to pick it up. Maybe some of you guys know down in the comments and can let me know how to fix this, but for now, if ever I need to move it, it means I'm going to duplicate it for some reason. I worked on casting some of the components for it, and when I tried to attach that, it rendered a really strange way, so I had to break it and put it back down again. That seemed to fix the way it was rendering, so it was looking pretty good. I made all the wheels in the casting basin, but when I checked to see what I needed next, it was an even bigger list of stuff, most of which required me to make a steam hammer to process the components further after casting. It could be a lot worse though. The steam hammer is one of the smallest multi-blocks from Immersive Railroading, and I got to work on making the components for it after getting a little bit of food during the day. I had to clear out some extra room to make more machines because I'd already filled up all the available space. One day I'm going to make a cool building to house these machines, but I probably won't get to it in this 100 days video, because what I really need right now are the machines themselves so that I can make the components for my locomotive. I spent most of the night casting components and then processing them in the steam hammer before attaching them to the train, and I did that all throughout the next day as well. By the afternoon of day 81, I finished everything that I could make from just the casting basin and steam hammer, and had to move on to things that required the plate and boiler machines. The plate machine is the biggest machine from Immersive Railroading as far as I know, so I had to return to the villager trading and the crafting table to work on getting the dozens of blocks required for the machine. I made a third coke oven the next day and threw the last of the coal that I had into it before I set out on search of, well, you guessed it, yet more coal. This time I journeyed to a new biome that I had been to before, just a regular mountain biome that was not very far away. And on the way there, I found a really big marble structure that had another one of those floating crystals, and it had some constellation paper, some cool magic stuff that I'll be using at some point. The mountains contained way more coal than any other biome I'd been to, which was great. If only I just had Silk Touch pickaxe at the time, I could have quadrupled my coal. As so often happens, on my second day of mining, a tornado showed up, but I was able to evade it by going around behind the mountains through the forest. And I made it home just in time before an invasion to run underground and hide in my staircase, where I was safe from the mobs until they fell through the ceiling, having mined a tunnel all the way down to me. No lasting harm was done though, and I got to exact my revenge on some mobs that got stuck in a hole. They hadn't managed to dig all the way down to me yet, luckily. Since I'd already gotten the steel scaffolding from trading, I worked on making the heavy engineering blocks, which really hurts my soul because it's just a huge pain crafting so many pistons and then using them all in the heavy engineering blocks. But if only that was all I had to do, because I still had to get the light engineering blocks, and I was actually starting to run out of copper. But my problem was quickly solved by a mining trip underground where I got tons and tons of ore. In between making machine components, I suffered a brief bout of kitchen building where I made a toaster that apparently contains just lava. It's how you cook your toast, you stick it next to lava. Sounds like a good idea. and I made the oven, which at least doesn't involve literal lava cooking your food, as far as I know. I did have to eventually stop messing around with my food in order to return to the pressing task of making over a stack of light engineering blocks. But eventually, after using all of my steel again and much of my iron and copper, I was able to get everything I needed, and I dumped down a ton of blocks to form this crazy machine. And you might be wondering, whoa, what do we even need this machine for? Well, this giant thing just takes blocks of steel and turns it into plates, which don't even look that big. It's a whole lot of building and effort to get some plates. Oh, and let's not forget, some of those plates have to go through yet another machine to be turned into boiler segments, because of course. Thank goodness this machine, it's small. It's tiny compared to everything else I've had to make except for the steam hammer. I attached some of the plates by themselves to my locomotive, and it filled in the front, but still most of the rest of it is missing. But what I'm definitely not missing are mob spawners, which I can carry around, and of course, onions. At this point, everything that was left of the locomotive required multiple blocks of steel, which I had to wait around for, so I started finishing my factory building with the shingles, which I initially misplaced with my building gadget, which was a huge pain. I had to go around and remove all of them, but eventually I got it in the correct spot. And while I was doing that, I was getting steel, which I turned into some of the large plates, which I then stuck in the boiler roller machine, or something like that. It turns the plate into like this big tube for the boiler. There's only one thing missing now, the cap, I believe, which needs an additional 7 steel blocks, so here I go building again. I worked on making an actual street in front of my factory and a bridge over the little area of river so I don't have to parkour and get stuck and have a miserable time every time I want to go back and forth between my areas. Day 93 was the day at which I got my 7 steel plates. In other words, everything that I needed for the last piece of my locomotive. And there we are, it's finished. All I need to do is give it some fuel and some water, and it's ready to start moving on its very short track. But look at the interior, look how cool this is. There's all these controls and gauges and everything, and the keybinds are super complicated. All around, it's a really nice looking mod. The models look amazing, and it's even cooler when you get to start riding the trains. A little bit less cool, however, was the acid rain that showed up immediately after I finished my locomotive. I spent the next couple days fully finishing my factory building by adding all of the framed blocks that didn't get saved in the schematic. For some reason, the game treats them as tile entities, so the schematic ignores them. Maybe there's a way for the schematic to save tile entities though, in which case that would probably solve the problem. I stopped by the desert village as well so I could grab all of the bookshelves from it, because I really wanted to set up an enchantment table. I set up a super quick garden cloche to grow cactus in so that I could make enough cyan dye for the cyan terracotta that would go and fill in the rest of my roof. And while I was trying to finish the smokestack with all the framed walls, I got pulled off by a stupid tornado that showed up, and then I got stuck in it for another 5 minutes or so before I could finally get out of it and go back to actually building my factory. It wasn't until the next morning that the tornado went away and I was able to finish my smokestack, along with the anchor, the last schematic in place that I would need to finish off everything that was left. In other words, just a cyan terracotta for the roof and a little bit of ventilation that had yet to be installed. Once that was all set up, I did some enchanting and immediately got a Great Fortune pickaxe, and I also was lucky enough to get Silk Touch a little bit later on in my enchanting spree. No more of this 1 coal per ore. I'll be getting 4 coal per ore, which is good because I'm going to need coal to power my locomotive in addition to the water. You can see here I threw a bit of water into the tank, and also I just started with a little bit of coal because I'm not ready to move it yet. I don't have very far to move it, but I just figured I'd start it up because you have to increase the temperature first before it'll even start producing steam and increasing the pressure that allows you to move. So the logical thing to do while waiting for that was to just go mine a bit of coal. Remember that chem thrower I got a really long time ago from a loot chest? Well, I realized that you could put creosote oil in it and use that because it is flammable. I continued expanding the bridge out over the water, and I started trying to figure out how I would make the railway curve around and go into the hill so that it could eventually reach what will eventually be a train station back behind my current base. This right here has got to be one of the worst shootouts of all time. Not only did I run out of ammo in my revolver, but I succeeded in creating the world's best FPS lag machine with my flamethrower. Day 99, the last full day, I started digging a tunnel where the railway would eventually go from my current base, and I had to add some extra ventilation in my factory because the current vents weren't reaching far enough to get all the pollution from my coke ovens, and the last thing I wanted was my factory blowing up. The entire rest of that day was spent just working on my train bridge, trying to lay down as much track as I could in preparation for the 100th day where I would test out my locomotive. Well, here we are everyone, day 100 with a completed factory and a completed locomotive all set and ready to go. I may not have a whole lot of track right at this moment, but I think it's pretty cool and I can't wait to do more in the next video. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. If you want to see more of the Industrial Revolution in a part 2 of this series, then make sure to leave a like and let me know down in the comments. But until then, have a good one everyone. See ya.